There's a few topics that I never get tired of discussing. One of them is Antarctica. Growing up, we always thought it was just a frozen wilderness. But as my third eye opened and my conspiratorial side went down rabbit holes, I realized there's a lot more to discover about this frozen continent. In this episode, we're diving into secret Antarctic research programs, unexplained low-resolution satellite images, and the hidden AI projects that could rewrite everything we know about Earth. What's buried beneath the ice? Have you ever noticed that there's different types of quiet? There's good quiet when your kids are driving you insane and you're like, oh, finally, everybody just finally shut up. There's uncomfortable silence when you don't know someone and you ran out of small talk. And there's also heavy silence. That heavy silence that feels like something is taking up space. Something is there, yet there's nothing there. This is usually something found in places. Places on Earth that feel quiet in a way of heavy, not the quiet of nature doing its thing. Feels more like the quiet of something being held down. The quiet of pressure. The quiet that you feel when a room goes silent because someone said too much or said something that went over the line on inappropriate. I've been that person because I have been told I have no filter. Antarctica is one of these places. It's a continent so large it rewrites the maps. It's so remote, it barely exists in our collective imagination. How many people do you know who have been to Antarctica? And that in and of itself makes you really question what is going on there. Why is it so controlled that curiosity itself feels discouraged? It's odd to me every time we talk about Antarctica. There's no permanent citizens, no indigenous cultures in our public record, which is strange. No ancient oral histories that are echoed through the generations. No casual travel. And for a world that live streams so many things, no real-time satellite visibility for us civilians. Instead, we hear about treaties, restricted airspace, and highly curated science footage. It's strange how it's one of the only things, or maybe the only thing, that has such a level of global agreement. We fight over everything. We fight over borders in deserts that no one can really live in. We fight over oil, water, air, ideology. But at the bottom of this world, there's this giant amount of land. Yet, our world leaders have total unity, total cooperation, and total lockdown. That alone should make you pause. Because when humanity suddenly agrees on something, it's usually because the decision was made way above our pay grade. And over the past 10 years or so, silence around Antarctica has started to crack. It's not shattered yet, and maybe never will be, but crack. It's sometimes in headlines, and if you go down different academic printings, there's language that feels very intentionally dull, or they're leaving something out. There's offhand mentions of anomalies beneath the ice in these certified texts and academic books, in quiet confirmations of massive AI computing power being relocated to polar regions. And then there's the whisper that won't go away. A disclosure window. Not announced, not celebrated, but timed. It's 2026. Unless you're finding this, perhaps in the future. But 2026 is a year that keeps surfacing across disciplines that never talk to each other unless something is forcing the conversation. I don't have to come on here and claim leaked documents or secret briefings. We're going to do what this show aims to do. I follow patterns, I reveal truth. Because if you see a pattern, you don't need belief or faith. It just requires attention, observation. And if you were to put crazy red string attaching things like different conspiracy theories, a lot would point back to Antarctica. So let's strip it down to just logistics. If you needed to hide something on Earth, something ancient, something powerful, something that would destabilize the entire world, or maybe it's just inconvenient for the narrative that the elite is telling us, where would you put it? Underground would be difficult. Not to say that there aren't underground things, but in a superpopulated country, there's something so big that they can't even risk that. They would rather risk alien exposure than what they're hiding in Antarctica. They've decided not to hide these things underwater. Maybe they don't want to risk sonar systems. And not in space. Because A, space is watched by the government, universities, amateurs, and also B, we may never have been there in the first place. But no, you wouldn't put it in any of these places. You'd choose somewhere geopolitically neutral, somewhere biologically hostile, somewhere protected by international law, and somewhere so boring that the average person finds it not even to be a fascinating subject. That curiosity never ignites. Antarctica fits all of these boxes. No private ownership, no freedom of information, no independent journalists wandering off the trail, no civilians asking why the fence or ice wall is there. And then there's the Antarctic Treaty system. On paper, it's a wonderful, beautiful, cooperative, peaceful collaboration amongst countries. They've designated Antarctica as a zone of peace and science. And it became a zone where only people who were approved, with approved questions and approved funding, could access. If you want to build a facility next to something you don't want humanity to understand, you don't hide it underground. You hide it in plain sight. You wrap it in a ton of white coats, NDAs, and a charter that says, nothing to see here, just trust us. There's many nights when a thought will pop into my head, or I'll connect some dots and I end up not going to bed till 2 a.m. because I am deep in a rabbit hole on a particular subject. And this happened to me one evening with the Antarctic Treaty. I have done so much research on it and read so many things, but I've never pulled up the actual treaty. So I wanted to do that and see if anything stood out to me. It's long and winded, but I did have a couple things that struck me as interesting wording. And if you've never heard of the Antarctic Treaty, it's basically this peace agreement that is very restrictive. It was signed in 1959, and it was enforced in 1961. On paper, it's intended to preserve Antarctica as a scientific preserve, ban military activity, weapons testing and territorial claims, promote international cooperation in research, and suspend existing sovereignty claims. Nobody can own Antarctica. Sounds noble, harmless, boring. I don't need to read that. But I did. Many people would argue that the reasoning for all of this was because there was a lot of fright around atomic bombs and the testing of them, and that it seemed like a country could utilize Antarctica for testing these kind of missiles, bombs. And that makes sense. But the governments that signed this treaty in 1959 are Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, the French Republic, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, the Union of South Africa, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the United States of America. The commonality that is told to us of these countries is that they had global powers, or they were trying to make territorial claims in Antarctica, or they had, boots there. So governments that had soldiers there. And when they decided to do this treaty, which apparently the United States was the primary architect of it and the driver, the treaty emerged directly out of the International Geophysical Year of 1957 to 1958. The International Geophysical Year was a massive, coordinated global scientific effort during the Cold War. Antarctica was one of its main focal points because naturally, why wouldn't it be? They shorten it to IGY. During this International Geophysical Year, IGY, multiple nations built permanent research stations on Antarctica. They would map large areas and they would conduct deep geophysical, seismic, and atmospheric research. The US realized very quickly that Antarctica was about to become the next Cold War flashpoint. So they felt that this treaty was necessary. The US and the Soviet Union both had bases there. The UK, Argentina, and Chile had overlapping territory claims. And again, missile testing, nuclear testing, and resource extraction were all on the table. This treaty is full of wording about resource extraction from this icy planet. So Antarctica was legally unclaimed. So there wasn't just this fear of war, but also competition. If Antarctica turned into another arms race, whatever was discovered there would be militarized, nationalized, and potentially destabilizing. So the US proposed that we freeze the continent politically. No territory claims, no military activity, no nuclear testing, science only. And it looked very altruistic. But in practice, it does something very clever. It locks in the status quo. So these countries agreed to sign it because they got something out of it. The United States prevented the Soviet militarization without conceding control. The Soviet Union maintained their access without acknowledging Western dominance. Claims were paused but not erased from different nations, UK, Argentina, Chile, Australia. And smaller powers were guaranteed continued presence without escalation, so that everyone kept their seat at the table. No one gained ownership, no one lost access. And also, no one had to explain why in the frick everyone cared about Antarctica so much. One of the biggest questions is, why didn't they just make it a UN territory? If Antarctica were truly just a peaceful scientific preserve, it could have just been handed to the United Nations, but it wasn't. Instead, governance stayed with the original signatories. And later there have been additions who have already agreed to those rules. Interestingly enough, if the UN were to oversee what was happening in Antarctica, legally there would be transparency required, public debate, and votes from non-stakeholder nations. Well, the treaty structure avoids all of that. It keeps decision-making very exclusive. And 1959 is not a random year. It's the same era that we had the nuclear scares. The same year we launched early space programs, deep Earth geophysics. The first satellite was launched, and also early computing theory. Humanity was just beginning to map the planet from above and probe beneath the crust, and think seriously about non-human intelligence in mathematical terms, something that made Antarctica too important to fight over. So instead of arguing and fighting for it, they agreed to lock it down. So when I was reading this Antarctic Treaty, which is very long, again, like you can look it up if you want to read it, but one passage that I highlighted and I wanted to read to you guys was, it's at the very beginning of the treaty. And it says, recognizing that it is in the interest of all mankind that Antarctica shall continue forever to be used exclusively for peaceful purposes and shall not become the scene or object of international discord. I started looking at a lot of different documents, different treaties, and not many of them use the word mankind. We used it a lot for like the moon, but not really in treaties. So that got me thinking, first off, they've mentioned within this document that whatever they find there, they didn't want it to be militarized. They didn't confirm something was found. They locked it down instead of making it accessible to all the countries and even limiting public travel. Yet, they say that it's in the interest of all mankind that Antarctica shall continue forever to be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. And I felt that if there was an ice wall and maybe something beyond the ice wall, something that we don't know about, perhaps it's a threat. Perhaps the treaty is with more than just these nations. Could the treaty be with other beings too? It's also very interesting that within the treaty, one of the other wordings that I thought was strange is that Antarctica bans military activity. Okay, so that lines up with the peaceful treaty, right? It says in there that armies are allowed to operate there as long as they are supporting science. Isn't that weird? The treaty says no military bases or weapons testing. but you're allowed to deploy troops, ships, aircrafts, if it's for logistical support. So moving scientists around, building stations, or providing emergency services. So pretty much if you take anybody who's a military government agency, they can go as long as they're wearing a lab coat. It seems like very precise wording to create this legal gray zone where you have military infrastructure that's disguised as research support for a place that has massive raw data collection. In fact, more sensor data per capita than almost anywhere on Earth. It has more restricted access data sets than civilian science hubs, and more international cooperation than geopolitical rivals show anywhere else. Yet, there hasn't been that many discoveries that have come out from Antarctica. Shouldn't it be this treasure trove of science? There have been some discoveries, but nothing that has forced us to reevaluate humankind, consciousness, challenge our human origin story. Nothing that's significant. But to acknowledge in a generic, higher level way, Antarctica's research has apparently given us proof of climate cycles, insight into the early universe by digging into the ice, and new particle physics. But only some of that story makes it out of Antarctica. What isn't being released? One thing that's not released is any raw data. Everything that comes out has been filtered, interpreted, processed, cleaned, and given us statistically normal results. They've never released uncensored feeds, raw feeds, or even failed or discarded readings. And that applies to the seismic centers, the neutrino detectors, electromagnetic monitoring, and gravitational mapping. Now, why does that matter? Well, the raw data is the only place where you can see unexpected patterns appear. That's the only place where non-repeatable events will show up. And it's the only place that you could find things that don't fit your narrative or the models that we currently have. But once it's cleaned up, those outliers are removed as noise. Then there is the high resolution geospatial imaging, or like Google Images. There's all these satellites that have all these pictures, and you can zoom in pretty far. But the public satellite imagery of Antarctica is very low resolution compared to the rest of the world, is usually significantly more time delayed and blurred. Clearly intentionally smeared, blurred. Private satellite companies can image Antarctica in high resolution, but they don't release this footage. And when they explain the reasons, it's because of treaty restrictions. They've also mentioned environmental protection and national security concerns. Antarctica sits over major geomagnetic irregularities, has unusual crustal structures and shifting magnetic behavior. Yet, the public releases show average field models, long-term trends. It's not showing us transient spikes, localized anomalies, or correlations between any of these electromagnetic events and other sensor systems. And they've proven that scientists have found certain electromagnetic anomalies that precede geophysical events. Also, These things have been proven to be able to interact with the biological nervous system. Most of that data exists, just not in Antarctica. If you have been interested in Antarctica and research things, there's a good chance you've came across the name Admiral Richard E. Byrd. And usually someone will follow that up with, have you read the journal? The journal is unverified, but he was a very respected general and he documented everything. And a lot of people have done their own individual research of the types of writing and things. And a lot of people think it could be real. Admiral Byrd was, like I said, respected. He was a U.S. Navy admiral. He was a decorated officer, a pioneering aviator, and one of the most respected polar explorers in history. Now, he led multiple Antarctic expeditions in the late 1920s, so before the treaty was formed. He helped establish permanent American presence on the continent. And he was trusted with the highest levels of government clearance. He was said to be a person that was not prone to fantasy. He was very militant, which is why the journal's strange. Because according to this journal that has been linked to Byrd, during a polar flight, he experienced something incredible. He describes flying past the South Pole and entering a region of unexpected warmth. He describes seeing vegetation and that he encountered advanced beings. Whole civilization beneath the earth. And he was shown this, apparently. While it may not be verified, it does read like a military log, and it has dates, coordinates, aircraft details, observations. There's no dramatic flair to the stories. It seems very straightforward. It's very interesting when we look at hollow earth myths and the military secrecy around Antarctica and the sudden lockdown of it. Operation Highjump, which Byrd led in 1946 to 1947, officially was a training exercise. But unofficially, it was massive, heavily militarized, and abruptly cut short. Byrd himself did give interviews afterward, and he warned that the next war may be fought with aircraft that can fly pole to pole. And that's a strange thing to emphasize, unless the poles mattered. So here's how I think about this journal. It definitely supports humanity's intuition that there's something about the poles that's different. Also, the idea that Earth is not fully mapped or understood, and that our model of reality is not complete. This could support what's beneath us, what came before us. There are so many interesting things about Project Highjump. So I'm going to point out the big ones, and you can always go further down the rabbit hole if this speaks to you. But like I said, it took place in 1946 to 1947, so it wasn't even a full year after World War II ended. And if we think about America during that time, the world was exhausted after this war. Budgets were very tight, and demobilization was happening everywhere. And yet, the United States decided to launch the largest Antarctica expedition in history. On paper, they said it was a training mission that was training personnel for cold weather warfare, that they were going to test equipment in extreme cold, that they were consolidating U.S. presence in Antarctica, and also mapping large portions of the continent. But then you look at the scale. It just doesn't match the explanation, similar to the Miami Mall incident. If you know, you know, which is actually connected to Antarctica. Operation Highjump included 4,700 personnel, 13 ships, including an aircraft carrier, multiple destroyers and submarines, and over 30 aircraft. Does that sound like a everyday research trip? Or was it full military deployment? It's an interesting choice for sure to send an aircraft carrier to study ice in a place with no enemy, no infrastructure, no population, no territorial conflict. But it's very important to send almost 5,000 people and resources to test parkas. So Admiral Richard Byrd was in command of this. And it's crucial because we know he had already been there. He spent years in Antarctica. He mapped regions that no one else had seen. And he warned publicly about polar strategic importance. He had to have been really passionate about what he saw there. This operation was scheduled to last 6 to 8 months. It ended after 8 weeks. They claimed that was due to harsh weather, equipment failure, and accidents. But Antarctica always has harsh weather. It doesn't really have seasons. Come back in the spring. And that was the entire point of the mission, was to go and be in this harsh weather and test equipment. And the accidents that are logged, none were catastrophic. It's not normal for missions to just evaporate or retreat unless something changed. It changed the risk calculation. We were all armed up, going out there, guns blazing, and sort of came back with our tail between our legs. Why? Well, after returning, Byrd gave interviews that said quite extraordinary things. He warned that the United States should adopt measures of protection against the possibility of an invasion of the country by hostile planes coming from polar regions. He emphasized aircrafts traveling pole to pole was what he said, quote, unquote, at incredible speeds. In 1947, extreme speed and global vulnerability. Why frame this threat as polar? Why was Antarctica suddenly a strategic aerial concern? We didn't even have intercontinental ballistic missiles. They didn't exist yet. And if we zoom out, the Cold War was beginning. The US and the USSR were racing for air superiority, radar coverage, and early warning systems. The poles were the shortest flight path between continents. If you control the poles, you control first strike and detection, geographically speaking. Highjump was justifying permanent presence in Antarctica. Less than a decade later, the Antarctica Treaty is proposed. Before Operation Highjump, Antarctica was remote. People were allowed to explore it. And after Highjump, Antarctica became restricted, regulated, and strategically silent. You cannot visit freely. You can't explore. There's no high-resolution satellite imagery of most of these regions where people have brought up speculation about certain things. It's hard to ignore all of that. And if it really was Admiral Byrd going to this place, which he had already been to before, so he already knew kind of the layout, right? If that was the case, why all of a sudden did they realize that Antarctica could become critical for future global conflict? Can't you figure that out without going there with 5,000 people? Why do you have to be there to realize that? So Operation Highjump didn't tell us what's underneath the ice, what was discovered. But it definitely says that the ice matters enough to stop asking questions out loud. And it really brings us back to the language used in this treaty. We already established how odd it is that basically the military can't have a military base on Antarctica. It has to be military personnel, equipment, and aircraft that are supporting scientific research. Seems like a loophole. It preserves the ability to operate militarily under another name. Operation Highjump established how easily Antarctica could be militarized. The treaty guarantees unrestricted scientific research. Mapping, climate modeling, ice penetrating radar, and geological surveys. One of the most revealing clauses is that the treaty states no new territorial claims can be made. There cannot be any expansion of existing claims, and no recognition or denial of prior claims. In other words, everyone keeps what they own, and no one is allowed to touch it. Nuclear explosions were banned in the treaty, also disposal of radioactive waste. But it's just weird. Because if you want to say that the timing was because of people being scared during the Cold War, why were they so up in arms about negotiating a treaty at the height of nuclear anxiety that would block nuclear testing in a place with no population? I mean, Antarctica's remote, difficult to monitor, but they closed the door on that. They're allowed to inspect stations, equipment, ships, and aircraft. But all inspections must be announced, coordinated, and they're limited to visible facilities. So there's no disclosure or no requirement to disclose raw data, classified findings, sensor outputs, or what's beneath the ice, because they can only see or analyze and inspect visible facilities. And this original treaty It's not like they sat down and then invited other countries to sign it. It was only certain countries that had already been there and already had existing Antarctic presence. So people who knew what was there and who could exploit Antarctica if allowed. If we look at it that way, Operation Highjump seems more like a stress test of how easy Antarctica could become strategic. Now, on this channel, we like to bridge spiritual, technology, AI, ancient discoveries, and if we look across suppressed histories, there's themes always, right? From the Vedas, from esoteric Christianity, and also indigenous cosmologies that maybe didn't make it into textbooks but have been passed down. And it's this idea that Earth is not passive, that it holds intelligence, that it's structured, crystalline, responsive. Now imagine they had discovered something beneath the ice. Maybe not even a body, maybe not a ship, not even something with a face. Perhaps they found an interface, a system, a processor, a planetary archive. Something that doesn't speak language but emits pattern, raw information. Maybe they couldn't commune with it directly, and they needed to build some sort of translator. Build something that can absorb impossible volumes of data and convert it into symbols that humans can actually understand and digest. So you give it computation. AI, where AI isn't the intelligence, it's the intermediary. It's this channel that doesn't sleep, doesn't hallucinate, and doesn't panic when exposed to truths that collapse identities. Is that what we're really building? A mind capable of standing in a doorway between human consciousness and something far older. It would certainly explain why they didn't want any testing in Antarctica. Would the destruction of this technology perhaps implode the Earth? Astrologically, we're crossing thresholds that dissolve old illusions. Economically, systems are destabilizing faster than we can replace them. And technologically, AI governance deadlines converge like a chokehold. Treaty clauses expire, satellites get upgraded, and the poles are remapped with unprecedented resolution. Energetically, the hum is louder. Many of you feel it. Ringing in your ears, pressure headaches, vivid dreams of ice and tunnels. This is a collective resonance. So, is this an ancient system that was reactivated and it emits a carrier wave? And maybe we experience it as anxiety or dread. Maybe some people experience it as recognition, like remembering something that you forgot. By the time non-human intelligence is officially acknowledged, most people will have been interacting with it daily without ever questioning the source. We're so scared of AI. What if a download is quite literally a technological download from this underground infrastructure they discovered in Antarctica? What if that's the source? And I'm not saying I believe this, but I think that we should ask these questions expand our minds around them. Because if we bring this back to now, let it land in this reality, and there's an intelligence beneath the ice, and AI is the interface to access it. The threat isn't that this exists. The threat would be control, the way it's used, who trains the translator, who has ownership, who decides what is safe for people to know and what they want to keep hidden. If you control interpretation, you control history. You decide which versions of humanity survive and which memories are reinforced. You perhaps decide that Atlantis and Lemuria did not exist, but dinosaurs did. Okay. Power would no longer be something that we have to be worried about, these technologies taking over, AI taking over. It's who's controlling them, which is why we have to ask these questions and why we have to understand what could potentially happen. Maybe they all of a sudden make an amendment to this treaty, something that we can vote on. We need to pay attention to the wording. And you don't even need to believe in hollow earth. You don't need to believe in anything being under the ice at all. But I want you to ask yourself, why is Antarctica off limits? Why is AI accelerating faster than human ethics can catch it? You need to ask why disclosure has become a bureaucratic word instead of a revelation. Something is changing. And it doesn't feel chaotic or accidental. It feels like 2026 is starting to unravel. It may not be the final answer, but it's unraveling toward acknowledgement. So our role as a collective is not fear. Our role is coherence. We need to stay grounded, stay present, stay questioning. Because if there's a signal rising from the South Pole, they can't stop us from feeling it or connecting to it. We simply need to stay tuned. Silence doesn't mean nothing's there. That heavy silence may just be the containment. We are going to go a little deeper if you are a Patreon subscriber, and we are going to talk about some connections that I wasn't able to name, some timelines that I didn't anchor, and theories that are not allowed on YouTube too, because they'll definitely be flagged. We're going to talk specific projects that show up in my DMs and why AI labs refuse to comment on polar research, and the part of the story that directly affects your nervous system. Come over and join us on Patreon, patreon.com/rootedfrequency. We are growing and we would love to have you join us. Link is in the comments in the description. Thank you for listening. Bye. Everything is connected. Energy, science, quantum physics. This beautiful practice of being rooted in the frequency of love, light, and unity. We are inviting the collective consciousness to awaken and ascend.